So this is a very quick summary of chapter 4 from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. So, beginning of chapter 4, Jane is surmising that because Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary, came and talked to her and discovered that she wasn't really happy at Gateshead, he suggested to Mrs. Reed to send Jane to school. And so she's kind of realizing that this may be a possibility. But also at the beginning of the chapter, pretty much everyone in the household, or at least Mrs. Reed and her children, are ignoring Jane. Not that they weren't already very distant and rude towards her. Now it's almost treating her just as if she isn't there. So then Jane is waiting around, and a carriage pulls up, and a man gets out of it, and then Jane is asked to come down to, I think it's the breakfast room, and Mrs. Reed is in there, as is this very tall man who at first she thinks it's like a pole standing there. He's so tall, and she meets Mr. Brocklehurst. Now, Mr. Brocklehurst, he is the owner of Lowood School, and that is where Mrs. Reed has decided to send Jane. We kind of get a little inkling of how Mr. Brocklehurst runs the school. He benefits from it a lot. He becomes very wealthy. His wife and daughter are very well off, and yet the girls at the school they look almost destitute, and they're treated very strictly and made to be very humble. And Mrs. Reed, of course, thinks this is just great for Jane and will be a great situation for her. Now, rather than sending Jane off to this new school where she can kind of start a new chapter in her life, Mrs. Reed tells Mr. Brocklehurst that Jane is deceitful and a liar. And this really upsets Jane, because to her, it's almost like before she even has a chance to start this new chapter in her life, to turn this new leaf, it's already being ruined for her by Mrs. Reed. And there's actually this really lovely conversation between Mr. Brocklehurst and Jane. He asks her where liars go, and she says, well, they go to hell. And then he says, what must you do to not go to hell? And rather than saying, oh, I shouldn't lie, or stuff like that, because she's not a liar, Jane instead replies that she better take good care of her health and be sure not to die. So you can definitely tell she's very clever and can be quite snarky. And so Mr. Brocklehurst gives her this pamphlet, tells her to read this story in it about this girl who died suddenly, and she was a liar, and how she's for sure going to, the pit of fire and brimstone. And he leaves, and Jane is understandably distraught and upset and angry at Mrs. Reed for what she's done and telling him that she is a liar. And she essentially tells Mrs. Reed, I don't deserve this. You are a terrible person. Whenever anyone asks me about your character, I'm going to tell them what a terrible person you are. And she says, I'm not a liar. For me to say I love you would be a lie. And because I'm not a liar, I do not love you, and I won't ever say good things about you, and you're a really terrible person. And Mrs. Reed gets so upset, and Jane just stands her ground, continues to say these very strong things that are really astounding for a young girl of her age to be able to express herself in those ways. But Jane kind of wins the fight. Mrs. Reed leaves the breakfast room, and Jane is left in there, and she's kind of left in there just to be alone. But the significant thing about that is, rather than Mrs. Reed sending her up to the nursery or even the Red Room or something like that, Mrs. Reed leaves and Jane kind of has free reign. And so she's contemplating a lot. She does go outside, and Bessie comes to get her. And it's actually a really sweet interaction between Jane and Bessie. Jane is realizing she's going to be going to Lowood School, and she gives Bessie a hug. And Bessie talks to her a little bit in ways that are like, Jane, you're being really forthcoming and really stating your mind a lot. And Jane's like, well, I'm not going to be here for much longer. And I'm pretty sure they walk back into Gateshead holding hands. But it's a moment that makes me feel happy and satisfied for Jane. She obviously still has a long way to go, a lot of self-development to go through, but this was a good end of a chapter in my mind.